it's my great pleasure to give Diana a warm welcome to this space. And Diana Laurillard is a professor of learning with digital technologies at UCL Knowledge Lab, formerly head of the e-learning strategy unit at Department for Education and Skills, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning Technologies at the Open University. Her research includes large-scale online communities of teacher designers and the use of a specialized digital course design tools to enable teachers to create and share new pedagogies for using learning technology. She's currently running 2 MOOCs on teacher development in digital course design. She's the author of a large number of articles and books, which include Rethinking University Teaching, a conversational framework for the effective use of learning technologies, and Teaching as a Design Science, Building Pedagogical Patterns for Learning and Technology. Her work has been widely cited today by over 20,000 articles and books. And today we will be discussing one of these articles, her 2009 paper titled The Pedagogical Challenges to Collaborative Technologies, published in the journal titled Computer-Supported Collaborative Learning. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. Well, we don't have enough time to do a whole round of introductions, but just wanted to welcome you all to this space. And I guess what we're going to do now is to start our session by telling you a little bit about what this space is for. So we created the Writers Meet Readers to generate a space to explore ideas together with the authors of the articles we read. It's kind of a reading group, but it's kind of an open reading group in the sense that we are being live streamed. We are inviting many people to join us. And it's also a very open reading group in the sense that it tries to create new paths for thought. In that sense, it's not a reading group where we are going to critique necessarily the paper, but we are going to use the paper to inspire us in our work as academics, in our work as designer, in this case, if designers are joining us. And yeah, just try to take these ideas forward for the future of digital technologies, basically, which is the work that DEFI is involved in trying to push. So now I would like to leave the floor to Diana to tell us a little bit about the background of the paper. And after that, we are going to have some postdocs. I think, I'm not sure if Tyler is here already, but Kinga for sure.
Yep.
Yes, hi, Tyler. Great. Good to see you. So Kinga and Tyler are going to help us kickstart a bit of the ideas that we're going to be discussing today by giving us some short speeches, 5-minute speeches about the impressions the paper generated on them. And then we are going to open up the discussion to everybody. And we're just going to free flow in terms of ideas among the Cambridge group and all the people that have been invited to this session for about 30 minutes or so. And then, so during that time, Diana is just going to be listening to us discuss, having her cup of tea, and then we can be engaging in intense or exciting and engaging academic discussions about the paper. And then Diana will have opportunity to react to some of the ideas she found interesting in our conversation. And we are finally gonna open up the discussion to talk to her in more kind of a Q&A, traditional Q&A, if you like, format at the end. So yeah, over to you, Diana.
Okay, thank you. So I've got to try and think back to 2009 and what was going on at that point. And it was an interesting period because I'd spent 10 years not doing educational research between 1995 and 2005, roughly speaking. And the impetus for this article came about because I spent a lot of that time at the Open University, where I'd been working on as a researcher and developer on educational technologies for, I suppose, about 10 years by that time, a bit more. And I'd written a book called Rethinking University Teaching in the early 90s, which I'd written because there was a lot of excitement about successive technologies coming through into education. And I guess it would have been the early 90s. We were just beginning to get the internet or the World Wide Web. And we'd already got CD-ROMs and things like that. And every time a new technology came along, people get very excited about how it was going to change education. And to be quite honest, most of these technologies were not going to have that kind of impact. They were good for certain kinds of things. And so I felt the need to have a book that would look at what technologies could do alongside what all of our conventional teaching could do. So that was the point of that book, was to develop an analysis of what does the research tell us about how students learn, what it takes to learn in education, especially higher education, and what different kinds of methods we can use to help them to master ideas and skills and high-level skills and so on. So that book, Rethinking University Teaching, which Pablo mentioned, did have the subtitle about a conversational framework, because that's what it turned into. Didn't particularly start that way. I started out by looking at all the different kinds of research on how students learn and then trying to distill something from it that would be a good way of testing technologies against each other. So that was from the middle of the 90s, more or less. And then that kind of led me into getting the Pro-Vice Chancellor job, which was about being Pro-Vice Chancellor for Learning Technologies and Teaching at the OU, which was the best place in the country, honestly, at that time to be doing that kind of thing. I think it was the first PVC job of that kind, because it opened up the possibility of getting the whole university to think about how we could do things a bit differently. And the OU had already done things differently. It was already interested in what was doing remote learning. So it was open to the idea of bringing technologies into teaching. Well, I say it was open to. There were a lot of people who were quite against it, but fortunately, the students were with it, the idea. And if there was any difficulty with any of the academics, then we just bring the student representatives in Senate into the discussion, and they would always say how important it was and how much they wanted it, which was very helpful. Okay, and then from that, I ended up in the Department for Education and Skills. This is now 2002, when they had begun to get interested in what was called e-learning at that stage and wanted a strategy. And they wanted me to go in as a consultant, but I felt that I wouldn't have enough influence as a consultant. So I went on a kind of secondment for 3 years, became a civil servant. So I wasn't doing any research again during that period. And we ended up with a lot of consultation across the whole country about what this should be and what it should do. And it was across all sectors, which was unusual for e-learning strategies then. So it went right from primary through to professional education and so on. And it got different kinds of organizations, higher education organizations, to agree to do things that would move the strategy forward. And it had 6 main lines of action, one of which was about developing the infrastructure more and making sure that all universities had decent technology infrastructure for the staff and students. And then it was also about the way in which we develop resources, and the BBC was brought into that because the BBC was at that time getting very interested in digital technology. But crucially, one of the 6 was about teacher professional development. And that had consulted with the teaching unions and teacher organizations and teacher associations and so on to try and make sure that teachers were behind this idea. Because at that stage, teachers, even in higher education, although as researchers they were using technology, they weren't using it for teaching. And there was a lot of anxiety about technology taking over our jobs and that kind of thing, which of course was complete nonsense, but they weren't to know that really. So it was a time when people took some persuading. So it was very important that one of these strands should be teacher professional development in the use of technology in education. However, of course, my time came to an end. We published the strategy, and then the people who I'd left behind at the DFES decided that this now needed to be handed out to an NGO, in fact, Bector, in case any of you happen to remember Bector, which was responsible for educational technology in schools. So they took over the strategy, and the first thing they did was to get rid of the teacher professional development section of it. So I was by now back in academe at the Institute of Education, which I thought would be another good platform for trying to do something on behalf of getting digital education going. And for me now, the focus was to do something for teachers, because it had seemed to me that all the way through all that development, and there was a lot of development and excitement about digital education going on, but both the corporates and the smaller startup organizations, everybody was focused on either students or institutions. Nobody was doing anything for teachers. You could say that the development of learning management systems and virtual learning environments were oriented towards teachers. But really, when you look at what those kinds of systems did, it was much more about the logistics of education, organizing people and making things available and enabling people to come together for discussion to some extent, but it wasn't really a major focus. So those systems were not oriented towards pedagogy, were not oriented towards enabling teachers to rethink the way they teach. So all of that was in my mind when I was writing this paper, because it was also a time when collaborative learning was coming to the fore, and people were saying how important it was for students to learn together, a more social approach to learning. So that's where it came from, was trying to map out what should we be doing to help teachers embrace digital technology, but not just be taken with whatever the current fashion is, but come to it critically and balance it out with our conventional methods and see what it would mean to do the best for collaborative learning and really supporting what people could do in collaborating online. So that was the background to it. I hope that makes a kind of sense. And then at that time, in 2008 to 2011, a new ESRC research program had started, Teaching and Learning Technology Program, it was called. It ran for 5 years, I think. And I had a research project within that, which was looking at learning design for teachers. So it was at the crux of that moment, this paper. That's the background.
Fantastic, thank you. That was a very, very engaging, interesting background to the paper. Clearly gave it a lot of relevance to when you wrote it, and still today, I guess. We haven't moved forward too much, I suppose.
It's depressing.
But we are moving forward slowly. So now that it would be the time. Oh, before I forget, Barry will be a bit angry with me if I don't share this with you now. So Barry is our comms person. Remember that we are collecting some questions about the paper, about the session in Slido. You can use this code to access our Slido platform. And you can also vote on the questions that you others have posed. That's the QR code if you want to go there. And Barry has already shared with everybody the list of participants, of those participants that are allowed to share their details. It's in the chat of the Zoom call. Yeah, just wanted to share that. And now I'd like to invite Kinga and Tyler to tell us a bit about, what they thought about the paper we read. What about we start with Kinga? And if you could introduce yourself, Kinga, first, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Diana, for that. Was very interesting, and so many points that are fascinating about the work that you've done and your background. and what you've said as well. So in my PhD, I focused on teachers and how they integrate new technology into teaching maths. And this of course, the lack of professional development for teachers, the lack of focus on teachers and how they integrate technologies into their own practice is sadly, hasn't changed completely since the time that you wrote the paper. And of course, collaborative. So just to give a slight introduction about myself, I come to this from that perspective of my work with teachers and the use of new technology. I have, since my PhD, gone on to work with governments and organizations on how they integrate new technologies into the workforce and how professionals use new tools and learn in the workplace. And so I have my own consulting company in developing learning in the workplace for adults. But of course, collaborative learning is actually a huge part of this, and something that not only came out of my thesis, but I also see in the working world, where it is such an essential part of learning, and it really brings together all the different other learning resources and learning opportunities that are professional development that is provided in the workplace. And creating collaborative learning would really solidify a lot of the knowledge that comes from all different sources. And incidentally, also one of the least expensive ways of professional development in the workplace. However, unfortunately, it happens extremely rarely. So although you wrote this paper quite some time ago, I don't see a huge change in practice, both in teaching and also in the workplace. I really like this paper because it touches on two what I think are increasingly more relevant and important topics. One being collaborative learning, and collaborative learning not only in the sense of students at school, but also as professionals in the workplace learning together, but also as a form, the framework that is developed, also understanding the way that we learn and understanding the way in the way that we collaborate. So I think that this is a very interesting and fantastic tool and framework to use, not just to help students learn together, but also to understand how we learn together and how we work together, which is increasingly more important. So I think it has a lot of really great implications and also applications. And of course, the technology aspect. This is something that is, again, increasingly becoming more important. And online communities, and I think that has come out in a lot of different papers recently, online communities, although they have a lot of promise and they had a lot of promise, they simply don't have the impact and as wide-reaching impact as was assumed that they would have, and they don't necessarily catch everyone. In fact, they don't catch a huge proportion of people, students as well as adults. And that is something that really needs to be worked on. And I really liked the paper in the sense that it brings together, it really highlights the fact that we need to go back and we cannot ignore all of learning theories and say that there's a shiny new object and here's how we use it that will change the world, which is often what happens with technology. So bringing in the different learning theories and going through the different theories that Diana does in the paper is wonderful, and bringing it together as a way of developing this framework in helping collaborative learning. And I liked the quote where she said that without a clear representation of the underlying learning theory, CSCL may miss the opportunity to exploit what the technology can do. And this we have seen time and time again, where technology misses the mark, not because it's not great technology, but simply because it's either not implemented thoughtfully and strategically, and because learning theory and how we learn is ignored. So I think that's a very important part of this paper and this framework. And so I know that I think it might be going a little bit long, but some of the questions that came out of this paper for me, first of all, is the implication that it has not just for students and teachers, but also for adults and workplace learning. And how the technology, how this should be used by technology developers. I would love to hear more from Diana about how she feels some of the practical implications would be for technology developers to develop the technology to incorporate this more strategically and clearly, and also how to translate the framework for practical use. I mean, definitely the paper is fantastic and it's a great read, but the trouble is always for practitioners and how they integrate it. And I would love to hear some tips on how this would translate well for practitioners, and also what are the best tips on how to implement this framework, both in the school teaching, but also in the workplace, and what maybe some of the best starting points are to start integrating this. And implications for the future. I think, there's a lot that we can dig into in the paper, which I know we will throughout this conversation. But implications for the future are definitely the aspect of workplaces needing to collaborative learning. So the need for workplaces to really integrate collaborative learning into their ongoing workforce and into the ongoing stream of work. So it needs to be woven into the way work happens. And as collaboration is being more an important part of the workplace, schools can also use this as a tool for students to learn together, as well as to learn how collaboration works, which I like the fact that in the paper it highlights that we need to understand how we learn and not simply just to learn together. But I think this has the possibilities for the future to show students how to work together and learn together as a framework, but also to really teach the framework and show what are the important ways of learning together so that we understand the structural process of that. So I think that is my time, but I look forward to the conversation, and there's a lot to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinga. Thanks. Tyler.
Do I go next, or does Diana respond to Kinga's?
No, so what we're going to do is we're basically going to let Diana just observe, make a note of the question that Kinga expressed, all the questions that may raise during the session, and then so she can relax now and just have time to think, and we are going to be engaging on all this conversation for now. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, it's been nice to hear everything that's been shared from Diana and Kinga so far. I'm glad to be here too. And where do I start? Well, let me start with a little bit about who I am and what I do and what motivated me to come to this seminar. So I run the Think Lab program for the university. The Think Lab is essentially we're like a research startup within the Central University, which is good and bad. Good in the sense that we're very flexible and get to experiment with a lot of different things. Bad in the sense that startup also means perpetually understaffed and under-resourced. So we kind of have to do everything and make things up on the fly, but that's also fun. Anyways, so my background, in addition to education PhD here at Cambridge, I worked in education tech too. I was at Stanford helping them run their online high school. So this was back in 2012, 2013, and this was a fully online high school long before our Zoom days. It was interesting to see what's changed and what hasn't changed in terms of kind of synchronous and asynchronous learning. I'm sure we're really proud of the work we did there, but it's been a topic that's come up a lot lately again since the pandemic. Yeah, and I guess the thing that we're doing now, just to get a little bit into the Think Lab work and how this relates directly to this paper and some of the questions it's raised, we're trying something new. We're enrolling, we have teams of research students, PhD students, and postdocs that join us for particular projects. Think Lab is very interdisciplinary, so the students come from all different parts of the university on a shared problem. Right now, we're rethinking museum access in terms of accessibility, inclusion, all of these things. We've worked with BBC and NHS in the past on kind of bigger picture problems. And the Think Lab originally started as someone else's PhD project that I sort of inherited. The Think Lab was supposed to be a professional development program to get researchers and students some real world experience outside of academia. And we do a lot of research and theory-based things in order to figure out how Think Lab works and what we can do to make it better. So right now, and this relates a lot to the conversational framework part of Diana's paper here, and it actually relates shockingly well to what we're thinking about now in terms of giving students, Think Lab students, the chance to create portfolios to kind of show their work based on comparative judgment, adaptive comparative assessment. We're having some like peer-reviewed stuff. And the thing that I keep coming back to with this, it's been hit or miss, I guess, to be honest, in terms of like how we're getting them to engage. Some students have really run with this to really use this as an online reflection tool and to engage a dialogue to kind of make their own meaning together about what they're learning, applying their skills and talking to colleagues who are from different disciplinary backgrounds. The thing that I highlighted in Diana's paper was I highlighted and circled the whole question, why should learners participate? I'm still thinking about it. I'm still actually kind of struggling a little bit with that, both in my role as kind of facilitator, not as like a teacher in front of a classroom, but as someone who, I struggle with this. I kind of go between two extremes of sort of an open kind of laissez-faire. I don't want to impose too much to kind of let people be creative and not stifle these things. And then sometimes getting annoyed and being like, okay, since nothing's happening, here's what I want you to do. So I'm still learning this process as I go, but that question of like how to get them to participate and how to connect the dots from themselves, I would say right now in our current cohort of about 18 PhD students for this project, we have about a 30% success rate in terms of people engaging in the process and doing their reflections and creating outputs and things. Everyone else is a work in progress. I think we will get there, but your journal article actually inspired me to do a little bit of Google stalking on some of the stuff that you've done. So I saw your the Times Higher Education thing and signed up for the learning design tool. I was kind of playing around with that a little bit. Fascinating. I hope we get a chance to talk about that too, because I was just looking at some of the templates and things. Yeah, I want to ask more questions about that. I know that's not like the main focus of today's conversation, but how can we use that to help students and participants actually create, like help them have a say in the learning outputs, outcomes from the very beginning, and how that can kind of be built into the entire process. So yeah, that's where I am right now. Sorry, a little scattered, but a lot of questions, and hopefully we could chat about it.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Kinga. So now the idea is to open up the space for anybody to want to, share their thoughts. And we have Slido here as well. You can also post your questions there. We have one here. Did remote teaching during the pandemic promote more pedagogical self-reflection or less? Have you gotten more interest in your frameworks as a result of COVID? Yeah, so you can write questions right now as we speak. We can vote on them as well. But please, yeah, if anybody has a, urgent reaction to what's being said by Kinga, by Tyler, by this question, please take the floor.
Thank you, Pablo. I've raised my hand, so maybe I can join the conversation very, very quickly. My name is Oudai, and I'm a PhD second year student focusing on education and peace building. And recently I've been appointed also as a member of DEFI. So my contribution is really just a reflection on some of the things that I felt when I was reading the paper. And thank you again for this very important and interesting paper. I would like to highlight maybe some of the drawbacks that I felt maybe it's good to bring them and discuss them and see also what people think of them. I felt that this paper is discussing more the formal education, which is not wrong. It's very important and right. However, I don't know if formal education can be just put in this one system. For example, we have a lot of people in the formal education system where they have learning difficulties. So I'm not sure how, if this model somehow touches on their needs as people in the formal education system, but maybe they have different needs. So I felt it's interesting to dig deeper into this point and try to understand, is this how, do we have a model also for people who have certain difficulties because they have different learning style maybe and different, different way of learning. This is a point I felt maybe I would like to inquire about and ask people maybe reflection on. And there's another point that I also felt. I felt this tool or this model, this framework is very helpful when we look at knowledge as information. This is what we learn. We learn information. And however, does it help us in the same way when we think of learning as the psychological, emotional, social learning, like learning how to be part of a teamwork or how to take decisions or how to prioritize? Is the digital learning really help with this kind of learning? If we apply this framework, will it also help us to learn not only information but also other kinds of social and emotional learning that we acquire only in the, maybe I'm not sure if only, but we acquire mainly, let's say, in the live atmosphere, in the live classes, rather than in the digital sphere. So I felt these two things, maybe things that I would like to understand more, and how Diana can reflect on them later. But thank you again, and I'll maybe stop here and pass the mic to some other colleagues.
Thank you, Oudai. Actually, I was wondering similar question from yours about how this model talks to development of skills in general, and socio-emotional being one type of skill, right? Many different types of skills, but yeah, a dimension of skills. Imogen.
Yes, thank you. I came across the paper some years ago now as a practitioner and a designer, and I found it very helpful in my design work, focusing similarly to Kinga on work-related learning. And so to the question on skills, I was thinking about this. This is actually a helpful framework in thinking about how we do teach skills supported by digital technology in the workplace. And I found it very, very helpful, and some of Diana's later work, design patterns. So it was interesting to try and adapt it, or to try and use it to shape design. I think it was helpful. It was certainly helpful for me to try and think about what we're trying to help people arrive at, and what approaches might be most appropriate, and certainly in the focus on how we can use the technology to support the learning, and rather than allowing it to lead the design. So I think that it was very helpful in that way. But I think it's helpful to think about which aspects of the framework, perhaps we're focusing sometimes more on one aspect than on another during design. And is that something perhaps that other people have found, or that Diana has found as she's evolved it since the paper?
So yeah, I guess the theoretical framework is quite complex, right? And it tries to lead to a specific type of more action-based inquiry, collaborative learning. And I suppose not all practices lead themselves to incorporate all those elements. However, that's actually, as Diana has written well in her paper, is the best way to do things, right? To engage people in action and thinking together. So I guess the question, to expand your comment, Imogen, would be, why not trying to incorporate all the elements into the practice, right? Into the learning. Yeah.
Yes. So asking people to reflect on their practice and take action together with the instruction, the instruction, the input from the instructor is, it's how that happens, in what order, and where the focus is. I think that's an interesting question as to how it's put into practice.
Thank you. If anybody wants to react to what's being said so far by Oudai, Imogen, Tyler, Kinga? The framework is said to be tech neutral. Does pedagogy change with new tech or stay the same? Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I actually, when I was reading the paper, I was thinking, well, there was a phrase in the paper that said, we should go further than just emulating what we can do in analog, non-digital life, using digital technologies. But yeah, is it, does pedagogy change with this new technology, or are we just trying to emulate what we do through technology? Cynthia, you go ahead. Cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so hello. Yeah, so I'm a first year PhD in education. So I work with teachers in rural primary schools, so in a low resource context. So while I was reading this paper, the thing that went through my mind was that how can this framework be used in a teacher professional development program in a context where access to internet and devices might be a problem? Because in my experience as a classroom practitioner myself, I noticed that there has been an increase in interest in utilizing technology in teaching ever since the pandemic, at least in my home country in Malaysia. And so now I'm working with the government, the Ministry of Education of Malaysia, trying to design and provide a professional development opportunities for teachers, and especially in rural areas where the resources are scarce, facilities are in dire condition. So I can see a lot of value in adopting this framework in a professional development model. But I guess we have to have a think about user requirements, like what kind of technology that we can use to make this work. Like in currently, what I'm doing with the teachers that I'm working with is that we use mobile technology, mobile chat apps like WhatsApp, because that is what is available to most of the teachers that I'm working with. But like how do we use whatever that we have in order to fully utilize the benefits that the conversational framework can offer? I guess that was what I've been thinking about as I was reading this paper.
So I guess that also speaks to the question, can you blend learning in such a way that you use technology and face-to-face professional development together, and can the two like try to speak to different parts of this model? I don't know, what is your experience with the WhatsApp, Cynthia? You're muted. Cynthia? You're still muted. Can we unmute Cynthia ourselves?
All right, sorry, I can't seem to be able to unmute myself. Yeah, so I guess what is lacking in my experience using WhatsApp in the professional development activities that I conducted with the teachers in Malaysia was that there wasn't any, like there were lots of opportunities for the teachers to I think share their experiences and reflect upon it. But I guess what is needed is access to explanations and presentations of theory. We like in the like in this conversational framework, for instance, it is, I guess the focus is on, I think in this paper it was talking about, so Diana was talking about I think learning activities in the classroom, but I can see how it can also be relevant in the teacher professional development, in the sense that like in online learning community, in my context at least, I feel like that is what is lacking. Teachers are not being given like a lot of input. They just gathered together in one platform, and just there's this disconnect, I think, between what is going on in the research, what is the latest research on maybe on learning theories and pedagogies. And so they're just it's very technocentric, I would say. And so these are the latest tools and apps that can use to teach your students, but it's very disconnected from learning theories, how to make learning more effective. And I guess I also want to share, like I have had experience with some teacher certification programs organized by companies such as Apple, Microsoft, and I mean, just a little bit of reflections, like there's this one example of a teacher certification program, like a sample lesson plan by Apple, where students are being asked to do a project, the video project using iMovie, to learn mathematics. But I can't help pondering how much the students are thinking about mathematics while engaged in an iMovie video project about equations, uses cooking utensils. It is. I think this is more on like getting the students to learn how to use iMovie to create videos rather than on the content of the curriculum itself. And Microsoft did the same thing with its Minecraft. So there's this lesson plan where the students are required to build like a Minecraft world to combat the problem of senior citizen loneliness. But I don't know to what extent this is relevant to the learning objectives. So while acknowledging that tasks like this can serve some important non-academic purposes, I think Microsoft recommended project gets students to be engaged mostly with its popular Minecraft virtual world and not the purported real world that it claims to utilize. I guess so. It's just some thoughts on what is currently happening in teacher professional development that's related to technology.
I think you tapped there on a very important concept. I mean, a very important idea, which is about concepts. Who is bringing concepts and how are concepts embedded into practice? In the first example where you say, teachers just share ideas, share knowledge, but you want some sort of more knowledgeable other to be there, monitoring and facilitating that conversation. And in the other case, you mentioned, you are practicing something, but what is it that you are learning? So what is the concept behind that practice, right? Which is something I really like about this paper, is how it puts the two things together. It talks about, practice, like conceptualizations as practice, or practice as conceptualizations. Can't remember very well exactly how it's phrased, but it puts the two, practice and conceptualizations, together. I don't know if anybody else wants to react to what Cynthia was saying before we move on to Xinyi. You can just jump in if you want. No? Okay. Xinyi, then the floor is yours.
Hello. I also have some questions, and I will read this paper with great interest. I'm also a PhD student at the Faculty of Education, studying teachers education. So I was thinking this is really an interesting paper for me to read. And also I've thought that because of the pandemic and COVID-19, after the 2019 or 2020, I think our way of learning, either in schools or workplace, has been changed dramatically. So I was thinking whether this mode has been also changed, because in schools, I think like students perhaps in some cases have to do online study. So I feel like whether their experience will change because of the digital learning. And also I was thinking, because of my positionality is a researcher in the educational psychology field. So I was wondering about how I can use this mode to contribute to the teacher education. And also I was also working on the collectively learning. So I was thinking how this framework based on those learning series contribute to teachers to learn some like dialogue skills, because I'm not sure whether we can transfer those framework into like teaching material for teacher education, to teach teachers collectively or teamwork skills, like how to communicate with another teacher, or how to communicate with their students. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you, Xinyi. I'm sure if anybody wants to react to Xinyi's contribution. Well, I suppose the question there as well is related to the pandemic, is, are there, which we shared around in the group, are there any, new developments coming out of the pandemic that would be more aligned to this framework, that are, truly collaborative online spaces for learning? I'm actually not sure, like they've been putting teams together, but everybody complains about teams. Yeah, there are other technologies that being, trying to develop throughout the pandemic. Maybe you guys have come across a very good example that you might want to share of a good practice, a good design. So I don't know if, yes, Imogen.
Yes, I'm not on mute. You can hear me.
Can't
yes.
hear you.
I was actually going to say, rather than a good practice, I've heard of some really quite questionable practices during the time of the pandemic. For example, 8-hour-long Zoom workshops, which involve the teacher speaking to the people learning for the entire time, which I think possibly could, might benefit from some more design thinking. So I was thinking there is perhaps a need, very much a need for this sort of framework to guide thinking, because I think during the pandemic, there may have been in some areas a sort of grasp at technology to solve the obvious problem that everyone was faced with perhaps not enough thinking about pedagogy and how people learn and how technology can best facilitate that. So I think there were some gaps there. I'm sure there were many examples of excellent practice as well, but I think perhaps we're not quite there as all the design communities are not perhaps always quite there in terms of thinking these things through.
Really bad workshop, that one. 8 hours of people talking at you. Nice. Kinga. Yeah, Kinga, we cannot hear you.
Okay, is it working? All right. For some reason, it wasn't letting me unmute until you allowed me. Okay, so I very much was in line with what Imogen was saying, because wanted to echo that, because I think the pandemic has actually made collaborative learning and online platforms for collaborative learning worse. I'm sure there's pockets of fantastic work, but with the exhaustion of being online, with the exhaustion of really interacting online that people are facing, and also because of, as Imogen said, it seems like good practices went straight out the window, and it's been a bit of a hectic grab at not so great practices. I would be very curious to hear Diana discuss a little bit about how we can help to bring these types of frameworks in a practical way to teachers, teacher education, professional development in the workplace, so that sort of easy ways that people can start to implement these strategies, because there is truly some very unfortunate ways of interacting online and discussions and collaborations that definitely don't use good pedagogy. So I'd love to hear her thoughts on that.
Thank you, Kinga. Rupert, are you around? You want to share some of your thoughts so far?
Well, thanks, Pablo. It's all very interesting. I think a lot of people are wondering how Diana's going to respond to these questions and challenges. I asked that question about the whether or not the technology changes the pedagogy, because in some ways you seem to suggest in the paper that this is just a very good way of designing teaching and learning regardless of technology, and could be done without technology. And I think that's quite interesting, because people do change as the technology changes. At least, some people would claim that we need new kinds of pedagogy and so on. So I'm wondering about that and how this relates to the changes that are happening in education, and if you think your framework is a good way of delivering traditional, in a sense, pedagogy and conceptual understanding, or whether it is pushing forward to new models, new understandings of what education might be.
Thank you, Rupert. I actually, if I may also add a question to that, is I was really intrigued by how the model understands motivation. It seemed to me that it was kind of like understood as an affordance, like that you do, but the technology does something that kind of leads you to do something because it's what you are required to do or you can do. But I was wondering the same that I guess Oudai was saying, like, so why, or like actually Tyler, why would, the students need to engage in these activities? What motivates them actually to engage in this collaborative learning using technologies? So yeah, if anybody else has, a question or something to say before Diana can react to all these ideas, the floor is yours. Otherwise, we're going to pass on to Diana. Anybody? Yes, Ioannis.
Hello, thank you for this interesting seminar. So what really impressed me while I was reading the article was the user requirement argument. If I remember correctly, Diana said that most educational technology is designed without some user requirement analysis. So we have to harness the learning theories in order to understand what are the user's needs. So I'm wondering, since 2009, have we seen any changes in how educational technology is being designed and how software or platforms are being programmed that take into account individual students' user requirements and needs? So I think that's related to Oudai's question somehow. And I would like to hear some more about that, if at all possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ioannis. Anybody else? Okay, I guess, Diana, now you can speak to us, react to us. I mean, you can pick, whatever you want to talk about. You don't have to address all the questions that you're being asked. It's really up to you. And then we're gonna give you 10 minutes or so, and then we're gonna go back to have a kind of traditional Q&A with you.
Right.
After that.
How to select from that richness of interesting questions. This is very difficult. I've been furiously taking notes so I don't lose it. Whether I cover them all in 10 minutes is a bit unlikely, I think, but I'll do what I can. They were really great discussions and representations of what you got from the paper, which is great. And you put some challenging questions. So I'm just going to go through them in order. I think that's the only thing I can do. So to Kinga, first of all, how to make it practical. What are the tips you would use to take the use of this kind of conversational framework into action? And that's what happened after this paper in the context of the TLTP program. We were creating a learning design supportive environment for teachers, which is what led to the development of the learning designer that Tyler was able to find. And what that did was to instantiate within the an online tool for design the basic principles which are in the conversational framework. So there's a simpler representation of the conversational framework, which I could show you if Barry would be kind enough to put up slides 1 and 2, and I'll just quickly show you how different that is from the one that was in the paper, because I do realize that for teachers, that's quite a complex analysis that I put into the paper. There's 12 different kinds of interrelationship. So after that, I tried to narrow it down to something you can actually keep in your head. So came up with 6 learning types. So there they are. If you can run it, if you just activate it, you'll see that for each one, if you keep clicking, you'll see that for each of these learning types, there's a pretty standard conventional method. So learning through acquisition is lectures, learning through inquiry, the library, learning through labs is a form of learning through practice. Discussion groups is learning through discussion, group projects is learning through collaboration, and producing is learning through assessment. But all of those things are ways in which we get students to think, so that it's looking at that in terms of the cycles between the teacher concepts and the learner concepts, and the learners and other learners concepts. So those 4 learning types can be represented at that conceptual level. And then, as Pablo pointed out, there is a distinction between learning concepts and learning practice. And the learning practice is what you do when you do exercises and you do group projects and practicals, and you're trying to take those conceptual ideas into doing something with them. And the doing something with them might be something like analyzing a poem or something. It doesn't have to be making something, but the point is to put those ideas into practice. So all of those cycles of interaction of that learner represented in the middle are the active part of the cycle of the red lines. So that's where the learner is doing something, and the black part is what they get back from peers, from teachers, from the learning environment, and so on. And then, of course, they've got to tie up those two together. The concepts and the practice each inform the other. So that's why there's a loop down there as well. So if you just step through to the next slide, Barry, please. And there's the digital method. So if you step through those, for each of those 6 types of learning, the different ways in which the learner and the teacher are cycling around together, if you keep clicking, we should see some digital methods appearing there. Yes. So digital images, videos, websites, learning through acquisition, exploring the internet, learning through inquiry, testing a digital model, learning through practice, discussion, there'll be online discussion groups, text chat, Menti is another kind of app used for that. Collaborating, what do we do there? Well, you can get students to do something like draft a wiki, make something together, which is a digital object. In that collaborative process in itself will enable them to attend to the content of that wiki in a way that if they were just writing a summary on their own would be quite different. And then finally producing, again, you're getting students to make some kind of digital object. Can you just click once more? What did I say for that? Making a website. Okay, so instead of writing an essay, you make a website. Now there's something quite specific about that, which means you've got to think hard to be able to do it. Okay, can you remove that? And that was just to say, there is that way of making it a bit more practical to see the relationship between what's in the conversational framework, and it's sort of representing all those different cycles which are going on. And yes, in the workplace of the future, we need to integrate collaborative learning. And I think we do that by supporting the exchange and collaboration between people about what they're trying to make work better. Now, in the context of teaching, that would be a learning design, something like a lesson plan, only over a broader period of time, I think, and incorporating digital technology. So I'll show a bit of that in a minute, but I think I need to work through a few more first. But yes, as I think Kinga was saying in the chat, how do we support communities learning together? I think it's collaborative learning that does that, but you've got to have, you might call it a boundary object or a transitional object or something, but it's something that you make together. And this, as I said, in the context of teaching would be lesson plans. In the context of the workplace, it might be action plans or a new policy or a strategy paper or something like that. But you're working together on something which you then test in practice. So you've got this beautiful policy paper, you then take it to a town meeting within your university or your organization, and everybody complains about some aspect of it, so it's back to the drawing board. But that iterative process is how we learn in the world. So it's going to apply to learning in the workplace as well. And then Tyler had some very interesting observations there, and ThinkLab I've heard about, and I want to know more about it, but very interested in this problem of only some of them make it, and it's an issue about motivation. Well, the first thing to do, I think, there is to ask them, why aren't they engaging? Maybe pair them with someone who is engaging and get them to do some kind of task that requires a peer review process, and they begin to work together with somebody else. It could be something like that. And using the learning designer yourself to experiment with how you introduce it or how you get them to do things with ThinkLab. I'm not sure, but I think there are some ways in which you could, simply by thinking about it in the way that you'll come up with some ideas there. Now, Oudai introduced the idea of what happens, yes, we can use this, I think, throughout any kind of type of formal education. But your question was about students with learning difficulties. Now, students with learning difficulties still need to learn in the same kinds of way as everybody else. And they will benefit in entirely different ways, depending on what kind of disability or learning difficulty they might have. But let's take someone who is, let's say they're dyslexic, or they might be emotionally very shy. For them, it would be extremely difficult for them to perform in a group session in class to join in discussion. And for them, an online asynchronous discussion is perfect because they can take their time over figuring out the spelling if they're writing, and they can take the time to decide on an answer to a question or to engage in discussion and to be treated the same way as everybody else. They also, of course, benefit from Pappert's idea of constructionism, which I think I did include some mention of in the paper, because that's explicitly about enabling the learner to learn the way they learn in the world. So you're making something, you're trying to achieve some goal, and you get feedback from that environment, which enables you to try again. Now, Pappert did this in the context of helping people understand mathematical ideas like triangles, and you program something to draw a triangle by moving forward and then turning through certain angles and then moving forward and so on. And they find that what they've drawn is a three-sided square. Triangle doesn't join up. So then they have to go back to their program and figure out what do they have to do to make this work. Now, the great thing about that was what Pappert characterized as learning without a teacher, precisely because the child is learning in the same way as they do in the real world by trying to do something, seeing they don't quite make it, and then revising what they did. So if we can harness that kind of learning, then I think we can do a lot for people with learning disabilities. And one that I've actually been working on in the last few years is dyscalculia, which is the maths version of dyslexia. Students just don't get numbers at all. So one way of dealing with that is to give them a game, which is based on basic constructionist principles, where they have to make numbers out of other numbers. Now, this is a bizarre idea for somebody who regards the counting sequence as being a bit like the alphabet. It's just an arbitrary list of names. If you get them to make things out of other things, so they've got several different sets of beads on the computer screen, 2s and 3s and 4s and 6s and so on, they've got to make 5s. They can see an example of a 5, they can pull them together by dragging them together, or they can split them apart. So they see the way in which numbers are made out of other numbers. They are making them themselves. And that kind of constructionist approach, which we use in the real world all the time, is precisely what that practice bit is about. There's a goal, you try something out as an action, you get feedback on that goal from the learning environment, and you try again. And in that process, you hopefully reflect on your concepts and then bring those into making your action better. That's how that's meant to work. So it's a complex answer because there are many, many different ways in which students are disadvantaged or disabled with respect to learning. But I think it helps with the conversational framework is designed to help with cognitive understanding because it was those kinds of learning theories it came from. I don't think it's ideally designed for social and emotional learning, unless you make that your learning objective for your students. And then I think if you're getting them to learn to debate, for example, that's a practice. And so your learning environment then becomes a mock debate or something of that kind. And in that context, you are learning a certain kind of skill and a social skill. For emotional skills, I think that's much more difficult. You've got to have a lot of discussion and empathetic discussion, maybe role play and things like that. But that's dependent on having that as the learning objective. And whatever your learning objective, you could see the conversational framework as having something to say. So then Imogen was talking about design work and helpful for skills. And I think, as I was just saying, yes, it can help with design if that's your objective and you're trying to get people to think about design. And it was in that context, I think, that the question, it was somewhere, does pedagogy change with new technology? And that's a great question, because in fact, we can answer that from our knowledge of educational history. And when you think about the different technologies that have been brought into education over centuries, decades, millennia, think about the technology of writing and how important that was for learning, because you could represent things in the world in a place, which then stayed in that place. Think how important the technology of printing was, because now you could read. You didn't have to listen to the master. And you could not only read, but write. So you could contribute to the world of knowledge as well. Those technologies were absolutely vital for the way in which humankind learned. And then we used the technology of the classroom and the blackboard and all the rest of it. And that was a way in which we communicated more efficiently, we hoped. What we have now with digital technologies is an enormous range of different kinds of technologies, each of which helps a bit with one of those different kinds of learning. They don't do it all, none of them do it all, but all of them do something. And I think if you try to think about which technologies really change the pedagogy, and that's why that conversational framework that I mentioned has all those different types of technologies mentioned on it, because they do different things in different places. We're thinking about learning through acquisition, learning other people's ideas, learning what there is in the world, learning, what's being passed on to us. Then books and papers and journals and videos and websites and podcasts and all kinds of things can be used. But that's learning in much the same way as we always did with books, really. You're addressing, trying to take in other people's ideas. And what we have to do is to help students with that, because a lot of education is about that. Which technologies have really changed pedagogy? And I think it's quite hard to think of those, because even discussion, when it's online and it's asynchronous and it's text only, that certainly changes discussion. And I think it opens it up to being more accessible to more people, as I was saying. But it's not fundamentally different. I think the one technology which I would make a case for perhaps is interactive modeling. When you've got a model or a simulation or in a game context, where you can change something in that environment and then it behaves in a different way as a result of what you've done, that's very powerful. And you can do things there that you can't do in the real world. So in that example I gave you just now about helping people with dyscalculia put numbers together, when they put two sets of red beads together in the real world to make 4 beads, they remain red. In the digital world, they can turn into purple 4 beads, which is a different color from the red beads. Things like that can make it very different. And just being able to move things around on the screen, and then when it's made the right one, it doesn't just stay where it is, but it turns into a star, and then you build up a number of stars. Those kinds of things can make a big difference to motivation and to enabling the child to work on their own. And that's the critical thing, especially for children who are struggling with basic maths or something like that, is that you can give them that game to play at home. And that's precisely what we've been experimenting with. So yes, they can spend 15 hours playing that same game on their own at home. So for children who are really struggling with what on earth 2 + 3 means, that's a fantastic opportunity. So there are ways in which that I think is an interesting kind of change, but I'm not sure there are all that many changes. And I stick by what I said in that paper, which I was interested to read again, that the way we learn doesn't really change. Over the centuries, I'm not sure it's really changed in the context of formal education. People are all talking now about millennials and the digital natives who all learn in a different way from the way we learned. I don't think they do, actually. I'm trying to see ways in which they do. They can learn worse because they're inattentive or there's too much stuff coming at them from this wonderful thing we have in front of us here. But that's not the same as learning fundamentally differently. So I think we can go slow on that one. I think for the time being, we've got the learning theories we need. We certainly need more attention to papers on pedagogy. But now I've certainly talked for 10 minutes, I think, haven't I, Pablo? And there were so many interesting things came up there. But I got through quite a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, I
let's
think
continue on that. Maybe some will come back as we discuss.
you can keep talking. What I would encourage people to do is to, like try to react to what you're saying. So it's kind of more of a conversation in this last 15 minutes.
There's one very easy answer to that question from Tom. Have you got more interest in your framework as a result of COVID? And certainly, I mean, I used to do about 9 or 10 invited keynotes and things like that in a year, and they trebled over the last couple of years. So I've done 3 times as many because there's been that much more interest of people. I mean, this is about digital education generally, of course. People have got interested in it. So, and to all kinds of audiences as well. I mean, the most bizarre was the Society of, oh gosh, what was it? Pharmaceutical products suppliers. There was something like that, who'd always done e-learning for all their suppliers across the entire world, and had begun to realize they weren't very good. So they started using, wanted to know about the conversational framework. So that was nice. So yes, is the simple answer. Yes, I do believe it's tech neutral. And that other question which came up, I think it was from Rupert, about you don't have to use technology. And yes, the conversational framework is neutral with respect to technology. And that's what I was trying to show in those 2 slides that I showed. For each of those 6 learning types, you can name 6 different conventional technologies which support them, and masses of different kinds of digital technologies which support them. It's designed to be neutral with respect to both conventional and digital methods. And after all, it was derived from all the learning theories which came out of years and years of experimentation with digital methods. So, conventional methods.
Thank you, Diana. Question for Barry, actually. Can we make people being able to unmute themselves easily if they want to just jump into the conversation?
If you'd like to ask a question, the easiest way, you should be able to unmute yourself, but if that's not working for you, raise your hand, click the raise hand button under the little smiley face, and that will prompt me to unmute you. I'm not able to unmute people unless they ask for it, is the way the Zoom works.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, so anybody that wants to jump into the conversation, please raise your hand or ask to be unmute. Yeah, Kinga.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask, in implementing, I mean, it's wonderful that there's increasing interest now with more online learning and collaboration. But what are some of the most common mistakes that you see people doing when they are trying to implement your framework? Some things that advising how to avoid those most common mistakes.
Well, one of the problems actually is the name, the conversational framework, because people tend to think of it as being a conversation between a teacher and a student. And so they will often say things like, but what about the student working on their own? Well, that's what it's all about, is about the student partly working on their own with trying to understand the teacher's concepts. And I called it that because the idea around it came in a way from Gordon Pask's conversational theory. And Gordon Pask was a very brilliant, very eccentric cyberneticist in the 50s and 60s in the UK. Worked at Cambridge, actually, in his latter days. And he came up with a way in which humans and systems of any kind could communicate and talk with each other. And that's where the idea for this 2 levels of conceptual and practical aspects of learning came from. And it was and that came out of working through all these different theories of learning and trying to see what are they all really saying? Can we bring it all into one description? And his conversation theory model was so close that I felt the need to acknowledge it in that name. But of course, it ends up with people thinking it's about a one-to-one conversation, which of course it isn't. So that's one obvious one. Then another thing people say is that it's too much like a straitjacket. And I honestly don't think it is. You can make of it what you like. And are you really confined to 6 learning types, which is the latest incarnation of it? And yes, I think 6 is enough to describe the wide complexity of what we do. And they say, well, where's problem solving? Well, that's an aspect of learning through practice. So you can shoehorn it in somewhere. Think about what is the state of the student when they're going through that particular type of learning. And then I think most of the time you'll be able to see where it fits. So those are the kinds of basic mistakes I think people make with it.
There is a strong reference, though, to teachers' conceptualizations in the framework. And you just were saying, it doesn't have to be with a teacher, right? It can be more
It's called the teacher's concepts, So, I mean, you have in mind where you want to get the student. So it's very kind of balanced. It's the teacher and the student are almost on an equal basis, but they're not the same. So it's all about the teacher's concepts. That's what, or the kind of outcomes which the teacher is after. And so the teacher does have a special relationship. You could take that teacher's concept box away, and then it's just informal learning. And I think I discussed that in the paper. It's without a teacher saying, you've got to learn this and you've got to do it this way. It's your peers are telling you what to learn in that case, and giving you feedback on what you've learned and how well you play or do whatever it is you're doing. So I think in that sense, it applies pretty well to informal learning as well. But the teacher has a responsibility to set up the kind of learning environment in which the learner is able to do things that will implement the ideas they're trying to understand. And then the teacher can talk to them about it. They can question the teacher and so on. It doesn't have to be the teacher. It could be a website, it could be a video, it could be a book, it could be a journal paper, anything.
Anybody else wants to react or remind their question that they might want to discuss as a group?
So Xinyi was asking how learning theories help teachers teach and how the conversational framework can do that. If I'm allowed one more slide, is that possible, Barry? We do that?
Yeah.
And this time it's slide 4. Which is a representation of the learning designer. That's right. So that's a picture of what it looks like. And I can send all these slides if you like, so you see what these links are. So if you do one more click, you'll see what a learning design looks like in the learning designer tool. And it's got these different, it's got a sort of sequence of learning down the bottom, which will be different stages of the learning process. Up the top is the learning objectives and all those sorts of things. And then it's got different ways of characterizing what kind of learning you're setting up for the learner. That's what the colors are relating to. So you can see green for learning through production and blue for learning through discussion and yellow for learning through collaboration. And the pie chart just counts up all the amount of time you've designed for the learner to do all those things. So if you do one more click, Barry, and no, it's too many. No, stop. I have to stop because we're going to have to stop soon. But that just gives you a sense of, you can stop sharing that now, a sense of what kind of object it is. So do have a play with it to see what it does. But I think that's what I would suggest can help teachers, Xinyi, with thinking about how they're going to teach, is to work through not just a lesson plan, but the learning designer gets you thinking from the student's point of view, what kind of learning are they doing? And here's a mistake that people make, because sometimes they say, a teacher will say, where am I in the learning designer? Well, because it seems to have nothing for the teacher to do, because it's all about what the student is doing in order to learn. And actually, what they're doing when the teacher is presenting is the student is watching or listening or reading or something like that, paying attention to what the teacher is doing. And that's learning through acquisition. And so what you get at the end, when teachers first use the learning designer, they very often end up with a pie chart, which is almost all learning through acquisition and tiny bits of discussion or practice or something like that, especially in a university context, not so much in schools. But that's a way also of teachers sharing, because you can share your learning design with other people, or you can borrow someone else's and edit it into what you want. So when you were talking about how we can do collaborative learning in the context of teacher professional development, that's one way of doing it. It's through that learning design object, digital object, which can be shared between people, transformed, changed, edited, made your own, and so on. That's a way of enabling teachers to build knowledge. And that, I think, we're going to have to end in about 3 minutes. I think that's a kind of rallying call to end on, in a way, is that knowledge about pedagogy should be being developed by teachers, and especially now, when they've learned so much during the last 2 years. I mean, teachers have done an incredible job teaching themselves how to do online learning, pretty much, because we didn't have it done for them. And we've set up a couple of MOOCs over the last couple of years to support that process. But that was not widespread before, so they've learned how to do some of this. Now they need to build on that learning, and it needs to be recognized by educational leaders in all sectors that teachers need some time to learn how to do this and to be supported in sharing those ideas as well. So teachers have to become a bit like scholars and scientists. There's knowledge to be built here, and it has to be built collectively and collaboratively. So what we do in one of our MOOCs is we get teachers to design something for whatever learning outcome they have. And then they swap and do a peer review process according to some rubric we give them. And then they go back and they look at what they've done and they change it and improve it. So we're trying to emulate what happens in the scientific world. Don't expect to get it right first time. It's going to change. Oh, that's a fairly clear representation that we're out of time. So I'm sorry. So I think that's the final word then. Let's trust the team.
Sorry, Diana. Yeah, I just mindful of people's time and your time, actually, because you need to go. I understand now.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for joining us today. And well, today we have the season conveners. There were 3 of us, but most importantly, Diana helped us think through all these issues we've been discussing. And please do follow DEFI, Digital Educational Futures Initiative Cambridge, on Twitter, and you can also write to us on this email or sign up for any DEFI Cambridge events. And with that in mind, I just wanted to thank you all for coming today, especially Diana for joining us and helping us think through all these very interesting topics. And we'll see you next time then.
Thank you so much. It was a great format, Pablo. I really enjoyed it, and such great questions.